Most people look at Jax and see exactly what the show wants them to see. A cruel, arrogant, chaotic character. Someone who laughs at others' suffering. Someone who seems to enjoy pushing people to their limits. A person with no rules, no morals, and no real care for the people around him. And on the surface, that makes perfect sense, because Jax is abrasive, he is dismissive, he is selfish, he is at times outright malicious. In a world where everyone is already trapped in a psychological nightmare, a hell, Jax often seems like the one character that makes that hell even worse. But I think that reading of Jax, whilst understandable, is far too simple, because The Amazing Digital Circus is not a story built on simple characters. It is a story about many different kinds of people trapped inside a world that forces them to confront loss, identity, companionship, fear, and freedom all at once. A world where every character is trying in their own way to survive something that is fundamentally unnatural. And in a story like that, a character like Jax was never going to be just the mean one. Because the more the series progresses, the more it becomes clear that Jax is not simply cruel for the sake of being cruel. There is something else there, something uglier, something sadder, something more human. You start to see it in the little things, in the way his eyes shift at the mention of certain names, topics, or words, in the way his body reacts before his mouth does, in the way his usual confidence sometimes feels less like confidence and more like performance, in the way the mask slips, even if only for a moment. Because if Pomni represents hope, choice, and freedom, then Jax represents the exact opposite. Jax is not hope, Jax is not freedom, Jax is not possibility. Jax represents shame, control, fear. And once you begin to view him through that lens, his entire character changes, because suddenly his sarcasm does not feel like sarcasm, it feels like deflection. His cruelty does not feel like cruelty, it feels like projection. His chaos does not feel like recklessness, it feels like a desperate attempt to keep hold of something in a world where he has none. As the series goes on, it becomes clearer and clearer that Jax's persona is a front, a performance, a role, a way of making something out of a living nothing. Because if he can reduce everything around him to a joke, if he can turn suffering into a joke, if he can make himself the one causing chaos rather than the one that gets consumed, then for at least a moment, he gets to have control. And that control matters. Because more than anything else, that is what Jax craves. Not necessarily because he is power hungry, but because control gives him the illusion that this is still his life, that his choice matters, that he still is the one pulling the strings, even though that is the furthest thing from the truth. Because underneath that need for control is something even more uncomfortable. Shame. Shame for what he has done. Shame for who he has become. Shame for the people he may have hurt. Shame for the losses he carries. Shame that has been buried so deeply under the arrogance and cruelty that most people never stop to notice that it's there. But shame doesn't disappear because it's hidden. It festers. It leaks out in small ways, in reactions, in defensiveness, in overcompensation, in the desperate need to stay ahead of everyone else emotionally, so no one can really see you for who you are. And that is why I think Jax is one of the most layered characters, because he embodies something real. There is a version of suffering that looks loud, obvious, vulnerable, easy to sympathize with. And there is the kind of suffering that Jax represents, the kind that turns itself into mockery, the kind that hides behind ego, the kind that would rather be hated than understood, the kind that would rather hurt first than risk being hurt again. The kind that clings to control because losing control would mean having to face everything he spent his whole life running from. And that's what makes Jax feel so human to me. Not because he's good, not because he's innocent, not because his actions should be excused, no. But because the emotions are real. The need to feel in control when your world is falling apart. The instinct to perform when you're unraveling. The desire to stay ahead of your own guilt. The fear that if the mask ever slips too far, everything else will consume you. And I think that is why his arc moves in the direction it does. Because the moment Cain begins to reveal more of what is happening, the illusion starts to crack. And once the illusion cracks, so does Jax. He begins to feel that control slipping. He begins to feel himself slipping. He starts to abstract. Not because he is simply unstable, but because in Jax's case, abstraction is the final collapse of a person who can no longer maintain the front that once kept him together. Once the performance doesn't work, the jokes don't work, the cruelty and arrogance can no longer hold back what is underneath, the guilt, the fear, the shame, the consequences. And to me, that is what makes his story so tragic. Because when the time comes, Jax chooses to stay rather than leave. And that choice says everything, because leaving would mean facing it, facing his guilt, facing his shame, facing everything that he's done. So instead he stays, and in doing so he sets himself on a path that I believe will push him into becoming the final antagonist of the story, especially in opposition to Pomni. If Pomni is the embodiment of hope, freedom and choice, then Jax is the embodiment of what stands in its way. He is the part of the person that is ruled by fear, control, shame. a part that would rather destroy than be forced to confront, and that is why he works so well. The genius of his character is not that he's an unfeeling monster, it is that he's broken, disturbed, regretful. And in a cast full of characters we can all relate to in one way or another, Jax stands out because whilst his emotion, while ugly, are real, shame is real, need for control is real, guilt is real, fear is real. And these are the emotions that often make for the most compelling characters, because these are the emotions we do not like admitting that we understand, that we feel. The visceral pull of shame, the sharp knife of guilt, the desperate need to feel in control when everything is falling apart. That is what makes Jax fascinating, and that is what makes him, in my opinion, one of the most human characters in the amazing digital circus.